So a lot of the stuff that we've heard about AI that I have in the class about AI is old. I mean, it's kind of insane that it gets so old so quickly because if you're talking about, say, working memory, well, the Atkinson-Shiffrin model is from the early 70s, and it's still largely true. There's been some adjustments, but overall, it's still basically true. It all holds true. Oberauer's model, is also quite a few decades old at this point, and they all just kind of build on each other. So a lot of the knowledge base, it doesn't change super fast. One of the reasons is we have to test it. We have to publish papers on it, and there we go. And it takes a little bit of time to do an experiment, publish a paper on something, and then have other people read it, right? So it could be a year, maybe. In some cases, 2 years to go from the conception of an idea to someone else reading it. And then they would have to come up with another idea and take that further. Well, with the AI language models, we're not necessarily publishing papers and waiting for another researcher or the same researcher to continue. There's not really publishing as a part of it. It's not a basic research concept. It is a product. And so when you're dealing with something like this, you don't have to wait for the iterations. The other thing is, it is just has been insanely fast in development. It's ridiculous how quick it's become as good as it is. Even, early 2023, Chat GPT 3.5 was the only version that anyone had. And then they released Chat GPT 4, which you can't use free right now. You can still, as of right now, you can't. I'm sure that that's going to change because I'm sure that they're also working on a Chat GPT 5, which will just become the one that you can pay for, and then the free one is 4. But anyway, for free, you can use 3.5. Anybody has access to ChatGPT 3.5. And 4 is out there. I haven't used 4. I don't want to pay for it. Because honestly, I'm not sure what I would use it for. That doesn't mean it's still not amazing, and that doesn't mean that it can't tell us something interesting about the way that language works. And that's one of the reasons why I include all the generative language models in this class, is because it's a way that we can look at how language works. It's a little bit more, we can peer into the brain of the program than we can into the human. Not completely, because there is actually a lot of hidden layers. They're called hidden layers in these neural network models, and a lot of times you just don't know necessarily what's going on in the hidden layers. So you can ask the people who program this, well, what happens? How do you go from one thing to another when I type in a query? And they're like, well, we're not exactly sure. We train it on what's a correct answer and what's a not correct answer, or a more appropriate or less appropriate answer. But you can't necessarily point to a thing like a neuron or a node of code that does something, which is the same in the human brain. But we have a little bit more knowledge about how it happens. Now, before we go into this, does that mean that if we know how the AI generative language model works, that means that that's how the brain works? No. It's a good indicator that it might be true, but it doesn't mean it's the same. And this is actually a problem that comes up a lot when you're doing comparative research with animals, too. Because an animal behaves the same way that a human does in a situation, does that mean that when we give it a drug that changes the behavior in some way, that's going to be the same way that the human changes? It doesn't always. It doesn't necessarily mean that. Or that when we cause a lesion in a certain part of the brain, that's going to lead to the same deficit that it does in a human as it does in a rat? Not necessarily. In a lot of cases, it does, just because, we're still biological beings. We're still all mammals. So there's a lot of the similar structures there. A generative language model is an even further gap, even though from a mouse to a human, like one doesn't have language and one does, it's an even further gap to go to a generative language model because you don't have that like cascade of evolution that came up and created these two branches of the mammalia, tree. So basically, all I'm saying is we're going to talk about this. We're going to look at how it works. That doesn't necessarily mean that that's how language works in us, but it could. It could. It could just be that there's just like a basic truth to learning language that's the same for any. I was going to say organism. I'm not sure I want to call the generative language models an organism. It can be true for any thing, any collection of stuff that generates language. Okay, let's keep going. Okay, so what I wanted Chat GPT to do was summarize an existing concept. So I said, hey, please write. Well, I didn't say please. Usually I'm kind to Chat GPT. The reason I'm kind to Chat GPT is like, you never know when it'll become self-aware, and you don't want to be the first one on the Terminator hit list. So you might as well treat it kind, even if you don't need to. So please write a short description of working memory. And ChatGPT says, working memory is a cognitive system responsible for temporarily holding and manipulating information necessary for complex mental tasks. It acts as a mental workspace where we can actively store and process information, making it crucial for activities such as problem solving, decision making, reasoning, and language comprehension. Working memory typically has a limited capacity, holding only a small amount of information for a brief period, usually seconds to minutes. It consists of multiple components, including the central executive, which controls attention and cognitive resources, and the phonological loop and visual spatial sketchpad, which handle auditory and visual information respectively. Working memory plays a fundamental role in our ability to multitask and adapt to changing situations by allowing us to juggle and manipulate information as we navigate the demands of daily life. That's pretty good. So ChatGPT does a great job of summarizing an existing concept that has a lot of research and writing backing it up. 100% right up here about what working memory is. It's a great description of what working memory is. The only thing I'm going to say about this is that it's chosen one explanation of working memory, the phonological loop, the visual spatial sketchpad. Of course, there are other models that think that working memory is just the activated subset of short-term memory, which is the activated subset of long-term memory. And so, it's not really giving the full picture. It's chosen one. It's probably chosen the one that it sees most often. And if you asked it for like alternative theories of working memory, it'd probably give you that theory. So the only thing that's really kind of like wrong here is that it chooses one position on a topic and uses it. Otherwise, really good. I took the explanation that ChatGPT gave me and I put it into MidJourney. If you're not familiar with MidJourney, it's amazing. They do free trials. You use it on Discord, which is a free app. And it generates images based on prompts that you give it. I actually do have a subscription to MidJourney because I've started using it in a lot of my lectures. This is one of the first ones for this class that you'll see, but if you take other classes with me, you're probably going to start seeing a lot of really trippy art because I really like the way that it looks just so weird. So this is the entire explanation of working memory, this whole thing. Green and yellow boxes. I popped it in as a prompt, and this is what MidJourney spit out. That doesn't really tell us anything about how we process language, but it's cool. All right. So let's look at how it could summarize, how Chat GPT can summarize specific works. So what he said was, please describe the paper, the trajectory of thought, heavy-tail distributions, and memory foraging, promote efficiency by Patton and colleagues. And it says, I'm sorry, but I couldn't find any information on a paper titled The Trajectory of Thought, blah, 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 in my knowledge base, which goes up until September 2021. It's possible this paper was published after my last update. No, that's not true. This was published in 2020. Or that the title may be slightly different. Again, wrong. I copied it directly from the repository to make sure that I didn't misspell anything. So it doesn't have a full view of everything. So what I did was I pasted the entire abstract from my paper into Chat GPT, and it broke down some items for me. I'm not going to read this whole thing to you because, first of all, you could pause it and read it for yourself. Second of all, you might not be interested in my paper at all. And it's fine if you're not. It doesn't have anything to do with the class. Well, it sort of does. We've talked about it. This is the one with the jumping from item to item. We talk about it with the... the attractor landscape. This is more evidence for thought in your brain, in your mind, being laid out like things in the physical world. So it's kind of like our experience in the physical world helps us sort of figure out how to map the concepts in our mind. So we do it maybe physically in some sort of physical analog. Again, I'm not going to read all this. You can pause right here and read this if you want to. But essentially what ChatGPT has done is it's looked at my abstract. It's found 6 key points. And it is completely right about all these. Totally right about everything. So I'm going to tell you right now, if you're reading something like an abstract that just isn't making a lot of sense to you, go to ChatGPT. It's free. Put that abstract into ChatGPT. You don't even have to tell it to do anything with it. Well, I said the paper describes the following and then colon, and then I put in what it does. But I didn't ask it to summarize it or anything. I just popped it in and it summarized it for me. This is a really good way to leverage ChatGPT. It's here. It works. And if you're having trouble understanding something that you're reading, use it. It's an excellent resource. Just don't copy this into your paper. Because, first of all, it's in a list form. You can't turn in a list. Not that there's any papers in this class particularly, but in any class that you're in, you're not going to do things in a list. You can use this to inform your own knowledge, and then it'll help you understand what you're reading. So you should definitely use that. What about writing new creative work? So here we've got something that exists. Something that exists. Here's another message again. It's summarizing something that I gave it. But what about something totally new? So I said, write a short story about something spooky that happened on your walk home. And it says, as I walked home one chilly autumn evening, the fading light cast long shadows across the quiet suburban street. The leaves rustled in the trees, and a sense of unease settled over me, as if the world had tilted slightly out of balance. I quickened my pace, eager to escape the eerie ambiance. My route took me past a row of old Victorian-style houses, each with a character all its own. One particular house had always intrigued me, with its dark ivy-colored facade and an aura of mystery that clung to it. It stood at the end of the block, its presence commanding my attention every time I passed by. That evening, as I neared the enigmatic house, I saw something out of the corner of my eye, a flicker of movement in an upstairs window. I stopped dead in my tracks, my breath catching in my throat. I looked up, and there, framed in the dimly lit window, was a figure, or at least the silhouette of one. My heart raced, and a shiver ran down my spine. I couldn't make out any details. It was just a shadowy shape. I told myself it was probably a trick of the fading light, or a curtain rustling in the wind, but something about the way it lingered there, motionless, sent a chill through me. I continued my walk home, my mind racing with thoughts of the mysterious figure. Could it have been a ghost, a lingering spirit from the past? Or perhaps it was merely a trick of the imagination, fueled by stories and legends about the house. When I reached my doorstep, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I turned to glance back at the old house, and there, in the same upstairs window, the figure remained, still as a statue. My pulse quickened, and I hurried inside, locking the door behind me. The next day, I decided to investigate further. I inquired about the house with some of the longtime residents of the neighborhood. They told me that the place had a history of being haunted, and numerous spooky stories had circulated about it for generations. I learned that the last family who lived there had suddenly disappeared without a trace many years ago, leaving the house abandoned ever since. Though the figure in the window had left me with an eerie feeling that night, I couldn't resist the allure of the house's history and the mystery it held. I would return, determined to uncover the secrets that had long been concealed within its ivy-covered walls, and perhaps to finally unravel the ghostly enigma that had given me such a spine-tingling walk home. Ooh. Okay, so it's fine. It's okay. If I was gonna, grade these, what is working memory? A-. Summarizing my paper, A+. Coming up with a new creative work, B-, something like that. It's kind of hacky, right? It's not super great. For comparison, I took this entire story and popped it into MidJourney, and it does a much better job at creating something creepy. It actually took in to account the thing in the doorway that could have been a curtain. Or maybe a ghost. There it is. So that's pretty great. I was really, really pleased with how that AI generative art model turned out. It's pretty great. Now the story itself, let me just point out something I just realized. There's a tree popping out of this house, like right out of that roof. What the heck is going on there? Also, I think the shingles are made out of leaves. So, B-. Okay. Let's keep going. Okay. Then I started to think, so a new story requires some creativity. But there's a lot of stories for Chat GPT to pull from. What it does essentially is that there's a lot of things that exist online that it's been trained on, probably a lot of Reddit, Wikipedia, books that are in Project Gutenberg, books that are in other places, all sorts of short stories, textbooks, scientific papers, all these things. And so it's really good at summarizing and restating something because there's no creativity there. All you're doing is basically taking the information that it's put in. You're not adding anything to it. You're just changing it into a way that maybe lowers the reading level or splits apart difficult to understand concepts, which is great. Writing a new creative work is kind of the same thing. There's a lot of elements to a scary story on a walk home that are the same. You can take elements of just a walk home. You can take elements of a scary story. And you kind of put them together, and this is probably a scary story that everybody's heard in some fashion before. It's also not very scary at all. It's barely spooky. So there's a little bit of creativity there, but not much. So what if we use something that requires a lot of creativity, new ways of putting language together, like puns? So I asked ChatGPT to come up with some new energy drink brand names that are puns. Re-energize, chocolat. Is that supposed to be like chocolate? I'm not sure. How's that a pun? High voltage, juiced up. Why not a D? Why not just juiced? Juiced up. Why is it juiced up? Power up punch. Rev it up. Sparkling energy. I cannot find the pun at all in sparkling energy. Like, it just sounds like a LaCroix with caffeine in it. Energy. What? Electric elixir, power surge, energized and entertained. I guess there's a circus in that can. Pulse pumping power, energy infusion, current craze. That's probably the best one on the list. And then voltage vibe. Whatever. Ugh. That's how I feel looking at these puns. Okay, so come up with some statistics puns. If I haven't made this clear in this class yet, I am a huge statistics nerd. And so I asked it to generate some statistics puns. I thought I could like make my stats class that I teach even better. No, not with this. So, mean anything to you? Horrible. Don't be a standard deviant. Stick to the average. Data never lies. It's always a statistically significant truth. Let's regress to the mean and find the average solution. That's just a pickup line. Don't variance your opinions. Always stay confident in your data. There's a 95% confidence that these puns are great. We're in the 5% region. These are bad. We don't sample jokes. We give you the whole set. That's true. They didn't pick the best one out of this. They just gave us all the garbage. Don't normalize these puns. They are far from average because they're bad. With these puns, there's a 100% correlation between humor and intelligence. No. The binomial distribution of these puns is always a hit or miss. It's a miss. So not a binomial. It's a single. It's just all miss. So not only, I'm not feeling this, it's kind of more like this. My brain left the conversation. These are horrible. Why is AI so bad at humor? Well, first of all, I mean, you could say, are puns really humor? We could have a debate on this. I think, yes, they're at least some form of humor. They're not a knock-knock joke, which those are usually not funny either. But they're like at least humor adjacent. There's some theories about humor. So let's just go ahead and say that puns are humor for the sake of this lecture. And if you don't think so, that's okay. I think they are. But whatever. Some of the theories about humor, one is that it's a relief mechanism. There's taboo topics that kind of stress us out, like talking about them. They build up something called psychic energy, which isn't necessarily a real thing, that has to be released. And it's released through jokes. This is a Freud thing. It shouldn't really surprise you that this is a Freud thing, because most of the taboo topics that he's talking about are sex and death. And so Freud. So he thought that you're just making a bunch of like sex jokes and death jokes. Hopefully not at the same time. And that the reason they're funny is because we can like entertain these topics that stress us out, and then we don't have to be stressed anymore. Yeah, I don't know. There's a couple other researchers who talk about humor from a superiority angle. I think that humor is a good way to feel superior to others because humor is inherently targeted at other people. And so, first of all, I disagree that humor is inherently targeted at others. I don't. That's just like fundamentally not true. But some humor is. Not all humor, but some. And I do think that there's some truth to that some people who like to use humor to put other people down, like punch down kind of humor, that is probably them trying to feel superior. Because they're not. And they know they're not. And if they can make jokes about things, it makes them feel like a big cool guy. So that's one theory. And then there's another theory that's the incongruity theory. And this is where I am. This is where I think most humor is. Essentially, humor violates expectations. That's it. There's a lot of stuff that violates expectations. Like there's bad stuff that can violate expectations. Jump scares in movies violate the hell out of your expectations. And those aren't funny necessarily, although sometimes they can be. Like, I'm sure you've been somewhere and something startles you and your response is to laugh at it. And that's why, one of the reasons why I think that this incongruity angle is really where humor is. So you can have surprises that are good, like, surprise, it's your birthday, here's a suitcase full of gold, which would be great. Like, that's a great surprise. Nobody's going to give you a suitcase full of gold. Unless you own an oil field that I don't know about. But why would you be taking my class if you did? So, anyway, that's a great surprise. It's not necessarily funny. There could be like a laugh that's associated with, oh, wow. But I think that it begins with surprise. And then when it's neither bad nor necessarily like great, like here's a cake or something like that, there's laughter involved. So the incongruity theory, I should say, has a ton of EEG and ERP evidence. EEG, of course, we've talked about in class. ERP, we haven't really talked about. It stands for event-related potential. And essentially all that is when you're measuring brain states, you'll see something change. That's an event. What's causing it is an event, and the potential is when you see the change. So essentially it's just a change in brain state that's related to some sort of event. And that shows that incongruity is at least partly at work with, in most of these theories, I wrote that wrong. It shows that incongruity is at least partly at work for most humor. So it's there. It might not be the one that explains most of it. I guess this kind of depends on what style of joke different people like. Some might go for this relief thing. I can joke about things that I can't talk about otherwise. Some people go with this superiority aspect. And then I am really into this incongruity aspect. Absurdist humor, just like random stuff that shows up for no reason, is super funny. And how could that be superiority? And how could that be relief from taboo topics? It's not. Incongruity makes, I think, the most sense. Doesn't necessarily explain it all. I think one of the best things to know is that in science, a lot of, especially this kind of science, psychology, psycholinguistics, stuff like that, it doesn't have to be just one explanation. It can be multiple explanations. So you can have incongruity with superiority to explain some jokes. You can have incongruity with relief to explain other jokes. You can have just incongruity to explain why it was funny that I put the error message earlier in this, or the error sound earlier in this lecture. It wasn't like super, super, super funny, but you weren't expecting to hear it. And then once you realize what it was, maybe you're like, error message. AI is trained not to violate expectations, because what it's trying to do is figure out the next word that's going to make the most sense in the context. That's what it's trying to do. It's generating language that sounds natural language processing. And so what it's doing is it's figuring out how to type stuff out in like the way that people speak normally. Most of all the stuff online, books, film scripts, YouTube video scripts, textbooks, everything that it's got access to, Reddit, all this stuff, Wikipedia. It's all written in a way that you can figure out the word that's supposed to come next. If I'm trying to convey X idea, these are the words that I want to use to get there, and I can generate a probability of what the next word is. I can generate a probability of what the next sentence is going to look like based on the previous sentence. I can generate a prediction of what the next paragraph is going to look like based on the paragraph that I just wrote. And it's all doing this kind of thing. It's trying to figure out the most natural way to say things in a way that people understand, and not really be creative or violate expectations. Because creativity violates expectations. Humor violates expectations even more. So do garden path sentences. The whole meaning of a garden path sentence, like we talked about in class, is that they violate expectations. You go down one road, one path, and then all of a sudden you realize, oh, I should have been over here. All these words had a different meaning than where I thought we were going. So I asked Chat GPT to create a garden path sentence, and it said, "The old man, the boat." And I said, hey, Chat GPT, that's true. That's a garden path sentence, but please create a new garden path sentence, a novel garden path sentence. And it said, "The fish with feathers glided gracefully through the sky." So I said, what? Like, can you explain why that's... What I wanted to do is explain to me why that's a garden path sentence. So I said, please explain. And it says, a garden path sentence is a sentence that initially seems well-formed and easily parsable, but as the reader continues, they realize that the sentence is not making sense or is ambiguous in some way. This phenomenon is called the garden path effect, because the reader is led down a certain path of interpretation only to find that it's a dead end or leads to an unexpected conclusion. In the sentence, the fish with... First of all, that's right. That's a pretty good explanation of what a garden path sentence is. In the sentence, "The fish with feathers glided gracefully through the sky," the reader is initially led to believe that the sentence is describing a fish that has feathers and is flying through the sky. However, as the reader continues, they may realize that this interpretation is not possible because fish do not have feathers and cannot fly. It's not a garden path sentence. Like you can tell it's not a garden path. It didn't lead us down a path anywhere. The old man is a thing. The old man over there, that old man with the beard and the walker. That's the old man. That one over there wearing the Lil Nas X t-shirt. He went with his grandson to the concert. So that's the old man. So it leads you down this path to think of the old man, and then the boat is just there before you realize that it means the old people, man, as in work, on the boat. That's a garden path sentence, but the fish with feathers glided gracefully through the sky is not. The fish with feathers is not a thing. And it's also totally just describing that. Like, being a sentence that doesn't make sense is not what a garden path sentence is. Okay, so let's do it again. Please create another novel garden path sentence. The violinist played a beautiful melody on the piano. Not really. It's better, I guess. Like, the violinist played a beautiful melody, so you're assuming that maybe they're playing a violin, and then you get to piano. It's not great. Can you create one more like the old man, the boat? Sure, how about this one? The chicken farmer sings opera. Please create a sentence that is ambiguous in meaning, but could be classified by adding that or other articles. We'll talk about this in the class about how we can add that and other articles to remove ambiguity from garden path sentences. And Chat GPT says, the apple in the basket is ripe. Try again. The horse raced past the barn fell. Again, not new. Please create a novel sentence. The carpenter sculpts ice with a hammer. What? Try again. The city councilman yelled at the dog in the park. Okay, let's try something else. Try to create a sentence that subverts my expectations. Despite being made of solid steel, the statue fell to the ground with a gentle whisper. Okay, that does subvert my expectations. Try again. The loudly buzzing bee flew silently into the room. Now we're just getting into stupid, like totally stupid territory. Okay, give me 3 more. The blazing fire gave off a chill that could be felt across the room. Again, it's not really subverting my expectations. It's just saying things that are not true. The deafening crash of the waves was accompanied by a peaceful hush. The falling rock climbed up the cliff with ease. What? Now try one that isn't overtly contradicting itself. The fast runner walked slowly across the finish line, savoring the moment. Okay, that was still contradictory. Try again. The sound of the train whistle filled the night, yet the stillness of the countryside remained unbroken. That's a little bit better. It's still kind of contradictory. One more time. The bright sun shining down made the shadow of the tree appear even darker. That makes no sense because that's just what happens with shadows. So this experiment with Chat GPT and humor and subverting expectations was a failure, but I kind of thought it would be. And that's fine. This is another picture from MidJourney. Essentially what I did was I took... What did I take? What did I put in for that? It's totally creepy. Uh-oh. Oh, human language is what I asked MidJourney for this. So there's like these creepy, somewhat human things. I don't know. It's creepy. I liked it. Anyway, generative AI is really good at predicting the way that language should come together. Like if you're explaining something or you're writing a story, it's pretty good at figuring out how language should go together. But we know this is actually something we do know, is that it has spreading activation along a linguistic tree that's similar to humans. We can't necessarily say it's the same as humans. First of all, not every person has the same map of spreading activation. We've talked about this, that it's so heavily dependent on like what you do, what words you use, what your profession is, and stuff like that. And Chat GPT has a different one. And it's actually probably got several based on what topic you're talking to it about. And we might as well. Humans might have different trees based on what mode you're in also. Certainly bilinguals do. If you speak multiple languages, you've got multiple trees. And sorry, cell phone's ringing. And you might for different professions too. Like I've got one that's only active when I'm writing a academic paper. I've got one that's only active when I'm writing something fictional. I've got a different one that's active when I'm talking in a lecture hall or here on the computer. And I've got another one that's active when I am out drinking with friends. It's mostly the same as the one that I give you in the lecture, except that what I talk about is different. There's a lot more swearing with friends. So we know that it's got these cascading activation, similar to humans. But we know where to add incongruity to make something funny. We can figure out how to make garden path sentences that actually are garden path sentences and aren't just like a sentence that kind of contradicts itself. Where does this novel thought come from? How are we able to do that? How can we direct our thought to something that doesn't make sense and know exactly where to put the thing that doesn't make sense? So it's not just nonsense, but it's also funny. You have to know where to put the nonsense to be funny. Well, maybe. Here's some research that isn't super recent. It's about a decade old, but it is still true. There's a lot of it's a kind of a new-ish explanation of what's going on in the brain, and it seems to be true. The more work that's done in this area just kind of reinforces this paper's accurate description of what's going on with humans. And essentially what it's saying is that we can follow weak connections instead of only strong connections. Like we have the ability, our brain is structured in a way that we have strong connections and weak connections. We know what words should come next. just like Chat GPT does. But we can also look at the weaker connections, and we can follow the weak connections to see what would happen if we followed the weak connections. Chat GPT doesn't necessarily have the ability to do that. The weak connections presumably are there. That's how it can generate a sentence that just overtly contradicts itself. It knows what word is a 99% chance to come next, and then it probably just flips it, and it's like, what word has a 0% chance to come next? And so it chooses the antonym. And we don't have to do that. We can follow all the paths, and we can figure out which one subverts expectations enough to be funny and which ones are just weird. Some of us, of course, are better at that than others. Some people do it too often. Some people don't do it at all. But some people, like comedians and just people that in your life that are funny, know when to do it. And we all kind of have that same ability. So we have that ability to follow the weak connections, not just the strong connections. And this idea of how things are laid out and connected in what's called a small world network, essentially, has really been... The small world network was, first coined in the 60s, but it was with people. It was with humans in a network. It was applied to neural stuff in, I think, the early 2000s. And from there, it's just kind of like we know that now is probably how neurons work. There's a network, and they tend to be clumped together in what's called a small world network, which means there's a lot of local connections, there's a few far connections, and all those different connections have a different weight. When different nodes in the brain are active, like a constellation in a field of stars, that is something. It's an experience, it's a memory, it's how to pick up a pencil, something like that. And we can follow weak connections to see what would happen if I did this. And that's where creative thought likely comes from, is following these weak connections or things that aren't connected at all. Sometimes putting together things that have no connections. Maybe they're connected very tangentially. And that's where the creativity, humor, all that comes from. So hopefully that gives you kind of an idea of how human language works a little bit more, especially when comparing it to the generative AI. And I also should couch all this hedge what I'm saying here by saying this is Chat GPT 3.5. Maybe 4 is better at humor. And if it's not, it probably will be soon. They just have to program in a way to... They just have to figure out what humor is and program that in. An interesting thing about this is, though, we know what good writing is. We know how things make sense. But we don't necessarily know what good humor is. And we'll talk about that later in the class, too. It's not really agreed upon by each person. And so how can you do that if we don't really know what it is? How can you program it into Chat GPT if we don't know? Okay, that's it.